Hello and welcome to the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. My name is Claudia Rizzini. I'm the Executive Director of the Fellowship Program. The Institute is one of the world's leading centers for interdisciplinary exploration. We bring students, scholars, artists, and practitioners together to pursue curiosity-driven research, expand human understanding, and grapple with questions that demand insight from across disciplines. You can be a part of this vibrant community by attending public programs such as this one, visiting virtual exhibitions, or pursuing the special collections held at the Schlesinger Library. To learn more, you can visit radcliffe.harvard.edu and sign up to receive more information on news and events. We'll begin the program with a presentation by Scott M. Stevens. After the presentation, the speaker will respond to questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to submit your questions at any time throughout the program. We ask that you keep your questions brief to allow us to address as many as possible in the time that we have together. It is my pleasure to introduce Harvard Radcliffe Institute Fellow, Scott Manning Stevens. Professor Stevens is a citizen of the Akwesasne Mohawk Nation and an associate professor of the director of the Native American and Indigenous Studies program at Syracuse University. His primary areas of research include diplomatic and cultural strategies of resistance among Indigenous North Americans in the face of European and American settler colonialism and the political and aesthetic issues that surround museums and the Indigenous culture they display. He has a keen understanding of how dominant histories and narratives that disseminate in both academic and public domains have worked to validate the conquest, continued occupation, and systemic oppression of Indigenous peoples and lands. Professor Stevens has lectured broadly throughout the United States and internationally, and published extensively on his research interests. A recent published work includes an article on the tomahawk as an intercultural object throughout the colonial period of the United States. In the article, he studies the disputed and evolving meaning of an object used to characterize ideas of native savagery, but almost exclusively produced and supplied by Euro-American craftsmen. Additionally, Professor Stevens is the co-editor of Why You Can't Teach United States History Without American Indians and Homefront, Daily Life in the Civil War North. While at Radcliffe, Professor Stevens is working on a highly interdisciplinary project that centers the impact ethnographic collecting on the, that centers the impact of ethnographic collecting on a specific Indigenous culture, his own Haudenosaunee people, blending analysis of collections of material and visual culture that exist in museums and collections of cartographic, linguistics, and missionary records held in various archives. Professor Stevens will critically read the history of these collections. In his monograph, he will study the interventions and reclamations contemporary Haudenosaunee communities can make to confront the cultural alienation and appropriation that is represented in museums, galleries, and archives in settler colonial nation states. Professor Stevens holds a master's degree and PhD in English from Harvard University. He has been the recipient of various fellowships, including from the Andrew Mellon Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the Newberry Library. Most recently, he finished the Fulbright Scholar Program fellowship focused on ethnographic museum studies in Hungary. And now it is my pleasure to give the virtual floor to Scott Stevens.
Thank you, Claudia. And I want to say Sego Skunagoa, which is a traditional Mohawk greeting asking that is still the great peace with you. And I indeed hope it is. I want to thank the Radcliffe Institute, but I first want to acknowledge that I am delighted to be a guest on the traditional homelands of the Wampanoag people, the people of the First Light, on whose land Radcliffe and Harvard stand. I'm indeed indebted to the Radcliffe Institute for its generosity and for this precious gift of time to write and think among my fellows here that have been also wonderful support. I really want to thank the people I've been interacting with at Radcliffe. It's been a really heartwarming experience, and sharing our work has been a great treat. And finally, I want to thank my colleagues and my students back at Syracuse University. Much of this work has been done there, and it is with that institution's future that I'm also always concerned. So thank you for those opportunities. And let me just begin by sharing my screen and the PowerPoint I've prepared for today. So looking at this map, I want people to get an idea of the huge diversity of cultures and languages that exist in just the United States alone, forgetting that you're going to find similar changes in North and South America, Central America, Canada, and elsewhere. And these colored areas don't represent particular nations or cultures, but rather large linguistic groups, the way that Germanic or Romance languages might be represented on a map of Europe. The group I'm talking about are Iroquoian speakers, but we are the Haudenosaunee people. This area right here, which is commonly known as upstate New York, are the traditional homelands of the group we know as the Haudenosaunee. But I'm interested in a much broader way in indigenous cultures and the politics of indigeneity throughout this project and in my work in general. And I just want to say a few words about the way I'm using the term indigenous. So from a critical indigenous studies point of view, I want us to consider the term indigeneity not simply as a synonym for native or aboriginal, but indigenous as an assertion of a position, both politically and culturally. It's that capital I indigenous that I refer to. And by doing so, I mean to say, even though there is a tremendous cultural diversity in the Americas and other settler colonized places, we have one horrible thing in common, and that is the enduring experience of settler colonialism. So though our culture's life may be very different than that of people in Aotearoa, New Zealand, or in Australia, or in Patagonia, we all have the experience of enduring dispossession, genocide, and repression in the present. And so by indigenous, I am referring to those people that are minorities in their own homelands, right? Because it is such a large and diverse group, I knew I had to choose only one of them. And so, of course, I felt most comfortable choosing my own. So I'm talking about today, my studies revolving around the Haudenosaunee, or the people of the Longhouse. And if that term isn't familiar to you, you might ask why you don't know it. You may know us better as the Iroquois or the Six Nations, as the British called us. But in general, there's very little known among adult audiences about Native American culture and history because very little has been taught, right? The average age that most people stop learning about Native America in the United States on a national level is 4th grade. So when you're 9 or 10, that's pretty much the last window of opportunity you're given in your education to learn about Native America. Now, you might go on in college to take a Native American Studies course, but most likely one doesn't. And this fact then puts particular pressure on museums and archives and galleries, art museums, as institutions of learning where people may have one of their few moments in adult life to encounter indigenous cultures, both past and present, and to think about it with a hopefully a knowledgeable presentation. But that pressure put on museums means they best get it right. And as we know so many times in the past, they have not. And so when I'm thinking of these notions of Indigenous representation in museums, I'm thinking about that making up for that lack of education. But back to the Haudenosaunee, who are we? This is a picture of what a Haudenosaunee village may have looked like in the 17th century or earlier. We were known for living in these multi-family long dwellings, right? And that notion of the dwelling as a representation of who we were as a confederacy is very telling, right? So it is both a metaphor geographically stretching from east to west. With the original 5 nations, we would later welcome back to our community the Tuscarora, who had gone to North Carolina eons before and came back when forced out of their homelands there by the British in 1710, 1711 war, Tuscarora War. But the original 5 nations confederacy, which stretches from east to west, so you have the Mohawk, we are the keepers of the eastern door near the Hudson, Albany area, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the keepers of our central fire and the putative capital of our confederacy, the Cayuga in the Finger Lakes region, and the Seneca south and west of Rochester in the Buffalo region. The Tuscarora would join us, also settling in Western New York as well, near Lewiston. And this geographic structure is only one aspect of the metaphor. The other is that it is a civic metaphor for how we had to get along with each other. You can imagine that for a multi-family dwelling, some of them 300 feet long, to get along and function as a community, there had to be considerable attention to each family's autonomy and regard for one's behavior and as it affects other people. And this is the same for our nations as family, as kinship groups, living alongside each other in the league that we call the people of the long house. So we have to, it's a league of mutual recognition of autonomy, shared kinship. We come together in times of need and defense, and also to celebrate and promote the great law of peace, which brought us together in the first place. Today, this is a map of our homelands as we are I always like to think of it when I was a kid as not so much a contiguous nation, but a constellation of spots, like a constellation in the stars. There are 16 contemporary Haudenosaunee reservations spread across southern Quebec, southern Ontario, New York State, and one in Green Bay, Wisconsin, where the Oneida removed to in the 19th century. In a certain way, we're very fortunate to live in the region that was our original homeland, right? Though now greatly reduced and contained on our 16 reservations, we still have endured in the place that we have always called home. And we've also remained a remarkable level of cultural integrity in our languages, in our belief systems, our artistic practices, and in our life ways in general, given that we've endured 400 years of colonialism, and much of that at the hands of the United States, which we still, and Canada, which we still endure. So that's a background of who we are, how we see ourselves, but I want to talk about my project here today, which is about ethnographic collecting, broadly considered. And so I'm looking at these places that collect as places of both accumulation, but also knowledge production and cultural production. So I'm thinking of museums, which collect objects and artifacts. I'm thinking of archives, such as libraries, that collect histories, missionary tracts, maps and other materials on paper. And I'm also thinking of galleries or art galleries in particular, where endless representations of Native people can be found, not by Native people, but of Native people, just as almost all the writing that we encounter will be about us, but not by us. It's really only in museums with artifacts that you encounter our own works and self-expression. And with collecting, I'm thinking of, my work has been greatly influenced by the works of Tony Bennett, Ben Dibley, and Ralph Harrison, all Australian scholars, who wrote an influential book, at least for me, called Collecting, Ordering, Governing. And it looks at each of those acts as part of what museums and archives do. How were objects collected? How were they obtained? And that goes from everything from grave robbing, war plunder, coercive purchasing, right? How does our culture end up in their museum, right? So the how of collecting is always important. How are archives built? To what purpose are they built, right? How are paintings collected of Native people, and so on. And then there's the notion of it's collecting, ordering, governing. Ordering is the aspect of how are they organized and interpreted and granted a certain significance by the collectors. And this has been one of the aspects that fascinates me about ethnographic collection, is that what does it mean for one culture, a dominant culture politically or militarily, to collect the culture, the ethnographic culture of one of the peoples they dominate? To what extent is the dominant culture being allowed to define the cultures they collect as they interpret the significance of objects, sometimes without reference to the source community, or they make their observations on the importance or significance of our religious ceremonies, etc., usually to our detriment if it's missionaries doing the reporting. How do they collect those images or portray us in visual forms that will have, tremendous impact on viewers over the years? If you see dozens of images of Native people involved in violent acts against innocent settlers, then that is going to make an impact on you. That's going to kind of print an image in your mind that will not easily be taken away. And finally, how are these collections governed? i.e., who has access to them? Who owns them? Who controls them, right? Are they part of a collection owned by a museum specifically, or do they belong to a community? Do they belong to a nation? Are Haudenosaunee materials in Canadian museums part of Canadian cultural patrimony, or are they our materials waiting to be rematriated to my own culture? These are questions I ask in my work, and I go into each of these institutions with that interest, not only about, say, getting some of these materials back, right, in terms of repatriation or rematriation, as a lot of us like to choose, since we come from matrilineal cultures with tremendous amount of matriarchal influence in our world. Kind of getting a piece back is one thing, but many of these, like with the archives and the images made of us, they're not produced by us. They're not taken from us. They're about us. They are of us. And so part of what I want to do is examine those as sources for contemporary Haudenosaunee people. If we read against the grain, if we use them paradoxically in a way that they were not meant to be used, can they benefit us? One of the inspirations for that way of thinking came from when I was a student at Harvard and encountered this very paradoxical phenomenon, which was Jesse Little Doe Beard, a member of the Wampanoag community here in Massachusetts, felt called upon by her ancestors to help revive and reawaken a language, her people's language, that had been dormant for over 150 years. So there were no, what linguists call L1 speakers, or people that spoke it as their first language left and hadn't been for over 150 years. Well, how to go about that? That's a Herculean task. And she realized that one of the ways was the Bible, published in 1663 by John Eliot here in Cambridge, that contained basically this incredible trove of vocabulary, linguistic information and structure, which she worked with the help of other linguists at MIT in an ongoing project to revive this language, but with the paradoxical source of that revitalization being a Bible that was meant, in effect, to convert her people and remove them from their original culture by sending them on a different trajectory altogether, ultimately one that Eliot hoped would end up in their assimilation into British Christian society. So that just kind of floored me when I was exposed to that in the early 90s, that the Bible would be the tool by which they would recover their language. This is a photograph of one in the collection of the Newberry Library, where I had the pleasure to work as a director of the Native Research Center there for 5 years. And I had access to this kind of Aladdin's cave of material and was very interested in how it could come about that this work would be so fundamental to a moment of cultural revitalization. And one of the things I just want to point out in passing is that this would have been printed in Cambridge at Harvard, and it would have been printed at the Indian College, where there was one of the few printing presses north of Mexico City. And it's there that there was an Indian college founded in the 1640s and was set up and basically to educate natives to become missionaries to their own communities throughout New England and, spread Christianity that way. It was open for about 50 years. It closed in 1693. The building has long since gone. You will occasionally see in Harvard Yard archaeological digs going on periodically, as there is one now. And those have turned up remarkable things, like some of the original type pieces used for setting the type in the Eliot Bible. So we can recognize some of the script from that. So it was in that place that came about. And then, of course, this is just a screenshot of the Wampanoag page, language reclamation page, their website, which I encourage people that are interested in this to go to look at what they're doing. It's an ongoing project in their community, of course. It's very heartening to see members of that community holding up pieces of paper that say, now I can pray in my own language. Now I can, read the names of my ancestors, etc. It's a wonderful and inspiring thing. Likewise, I was inspired in my own research back in central New York. I was at the Fenimore Museum in Cooperstown and looking at this wonderful collection of Indigenous artifacts they have and art. And I was drawn to that pipe tomahawk that you see. And Claudia mentioned the article I wrote about that. And I won't recapitulate the whole thing here, but it was stunning to me that it said that it was an 18th century tomahawk, most likely of Mohawk ownership, made in England. And it said that without any, as though, well, of course. And I thought, made in England. And as I got researching about tomahawks, it was a well-known fact to those who study weapons that almost every tomahawk you see of this quality and craftsmanship is made in Europe or by Europeans in North America. As a trade item, for Native America. It would appear that one of our interventions on the item was that we asked that a pipe be connected to the head of it. So it, after use, you could have a relaxing smoke. But there was a sense that I thought this was our weapon, right, of choice. Well, it may have been a popular weapon of choice, but it only came from the source of Europeans who had the metallurgy and technology to make such objects. And so I became very interested that in terms of representation in art and in literature, the tomahawk itself was a kind of avatar of our savagery and cruelty, right? That you would see all sorts of representation. Here's a kind of diminutive tomahawk. And this is a fashionable halberd tomahawk. But it was a symbol of, often connected to Iroquois or Haudenosaunee people, of our supposed viciousness, our cruelty and war, etc., to brandish the tomahawk or raise the bloody tomahawk. You get a lot of that in colonial literature. The French tended to emphasize Iroquois cruelty in their representations of us because we were a long-term enemy of the French, whereas our English allies tended to represent us as valuable for our prowess as warriors because of our alliance with the British against the French. And that notion of, the diplomatic figure was prominent in English portrayals and some early American ones. This one on the left is of the Seneca leader we call Corn Planter, there with a pipe tomahawk. And this is a painting by Bartholdi, and the other by Charles Burt King, of the Seneca leader, Red Jacket, with his peace medal given to him by Washington, also holding a pipe tomahawk. In both of these cases, these pipe tomahawks were presented to them by George Washington during negotiations at a treaty in the 1790s. But I kept thinking, boy, if you didn't want us to use these things, why do you keep giving them to us? All this trade in something that supposedly represented our savagery. Recently, that pipe tomahawk that belonged to Corn Planter and had been in the New York State Museum in Albany was given back to the Seneca community at Allegheny to put into their new cultural center, figured there. And to be part of their story and the way they understand themselves and tell that story as part of their reclaiming not only material culture, but objects of tremendous significance to them. It's a strange story of that pipe tomahawk because though we say it was in the possession of the State Museum, it really wasn't, because it was stolen by a white anthropologist 80 years ago, working in the museum, and it was only returned by its most recent owner when they figured out we'd have no right to be holding this object. It should go back to the New York State Museum. And they realized if we really want to give it back to its rightful owners, it should be with the people that created it. In a similar way in my work, then, I'm interested in mining the works of settlers, scholars, and so on, in the way that the linguists mined the Eliot Bible in order to revive something. And so, there's this term salvage ethnology, where you collect everything you can because you're sure people are going to go extinct or their culture is going to go extinct. And so you salvage what you can. And I want to turn the tables on that and say, I think we can salvage some things from figures like the 19th century kind of so-called father of American anthropology, Lewis Henry Morgan. Lewis Henry Morgan was someone who in 1851 published this landmark study of the League of the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois. And in it, he talks about our systems of government and so on. He later goes on to publish some terribly racialist and racist notions about cultural development in 3 stages, from savagery to barbarism to civilization, creating this kind of Darwinian hierarchy of communities and peoples, that we are, well rid of, and I revile that type of material. But his writings on material culture and their care for things that have been in danger of going out of fashion, no one learning them anymore, have been invaluable to people trying to reclaim traditional arts. And this goes back to Haudenosaunee anthropologist Arthur C. Parker in the 1930s, working with the WPA to get people on the Seneca Reserve he was from to revive the making of certain material goods and arts whose descriptions he could find examples of in the writings of someone like Morgan, or in the collections that Morgan had put together for the state. My own work right now, what I'm focused on at the moment, is working with the map collection here at Harvard to expand my notions of the archive and cartography as a very important part of the archive. I had done a lot of work with the map collection at the Newberry Library when I was there, and this has just kind of doubled the impact of that. And what I'm interested in particular are maps that portray Haudenosaunee land as a kind of bounded space in a kind of post-Westphalian way of representing nation states on maps. Here you have Les Cinq Nations Iroquoises on a French map from 1689. This is a different map commonly called the beaver map, because in the cartouche it has a lot of beavers making a dam or something. But in it, again, to see this conception of our homeland really bounded like a nation state. You have the other provinces, you have New York, New Jersey. They're not too clear on Pennsylvania, because Pennsylvania has a shifting frontier, especially based on once it gets into the mountainous section in the center of the state, it has a fairly unclear frontier. But this Cinq Nations, here you have the Iroquois, explains, there's a long note about them, claiming that they are important allies of the English against the French. And here's one at the eve of the American Revolution, the Tyrone map of the Six Nations. And so again, we have the sense of, what I'm mining these for are, part of giving a clearer history of our dispossession of our homelands. But I'm also thinking forward to, we have a variety of land claims active against the state of New York. And I'm hoping that these maps, which not only show our sense of the recognition of our autonomy in the past, but also might be used to reclaim some sovereignty over territory in the future. So there is a kind of proactive aspect to this. I'm also, interested in the way images function. These famous 3 Mohawk and 1 Mohican diplomats that visited Queen Anne's London in 1710 and now are portrayed in the National Gallery in Canada. There's been a lot of interest in the tattooing represented on one of the Mohawk figures, and that has been an important part of a revival of traditional Mohawk tattooing, a thing discouraged as pagan by missionaries and so long out of fashion. That has come back and is being celebrated by artists like the Mohawk artist Carla Hemlock in this quilt, quilt collage of both beadwork, textile. There's wampum shell beads on the top. There's photography. That's her son administering a traditional style tattoo. And they're based on, elements in those images, as you can see on the man's chest, and then look at that. But it's another form of cultural reclamation by our own artists, drawing on things like Mohawk quilt making. Those are quilts at Akwesasne being sold to raise money for our language school. There's a photograph from the 19th century of Tuscarora beadworkers at the brim of Niagara Falls, selling their souvenirs to people. There's some Wampanoag made wampum beads that were valuable trade items to us. We didn't produce them. We traded them with this region. And she's bringing all of those things together as a means of reclaiming an active aesthetic, something we call visual sovereignty, reclaiming those aspects of our culture that, as I said, are sometimes alienated from us by being in archives, museums, and galleries. But as more scholars become involved, native scholars become involved with those institutions, I think we can reclaim more things from them. So, Nyawa, thank you very much. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Stephen. This was a brilliant talk. And as you can imagine, there are lots of questions. So let me get started. The first one asks, there is a push for the complete removal or repatriation, as you put it, of the Indian materials in the Euro-American museums. What do you think of this? Is there a possibility for the decolonization of historical Euro-American museums, considering the importance of education, or should there be more complete return?
That's a great question and a difficult one, because sometimes it's hard to know where those returned materials would actually go, right? There are increasingly sophisticated facilities, museum-like facilities at different reservations in the United States and Canada, but just as many places wouldn't have anywhere to take care of those objects correctly. And sometimes there's, alas, no community to return them to, right? So it's, but I think that more and more returning, rematriation of materials will and should go on as these opportunities, like the center at in Allegheny, that beautiful new cultural center, or another one they have south of Rochester called Ganondagan. These are, state-of-the-art institutions run by Native curators and so on. And those are wonderful places to have that story told now. There'll never be a complete return, but I think that more and more of these objects need to go home, but also need to be available for researchers in our own communities and others. Sometimes objects like this while away their time in storage at museums, and no one sees them. And so that's pointless as well. I think they should really start to appraise what they have and what they show and how they do it. We also need a lot more Native people working in museums and, having authority within those institutions that themselves have authority. Thanks.
Good point. Could you please comment on how properly contextualized objects, including colonial murals and statues, can be reappropriated from settlers' colonial narratives without resuscitating symbolic power that these grand historical objects hold?
I think sometimes, like with some of these objects, especially with monuments, I've never been in favor of like putting a long explanatory plaque or message with them, because I don't think enough people read it. We put up monuments to people and events that we admire, and that's the message they send. So I'm for moving them into a space where you can contextualize them and putting different narratives and different counter narratives alongside, each other. And so that people understand that this is not an unproblematic gesture to celebrate someone like Teddy Roosevelt or Jefferson or any of these people from the past. And that often are celebrated unproblematically, but have terribly, are parts of terrible systems. And so contextualization is a necessary way of doing this. Again, getting the, in these days of, we can't even teach critical race theory, which is to say, to teach the truth about, about the racist past and present of this country, then I don't know, it seems like a Sisyphusian task to try to correct these things, but let's keep trying.
Yeah. The next question asks, would you share your thoughts on how indigeneity can address the harm of cancel culture on the one hand, and the harm of knowledge and material extraction on the other by institutions, university, museums, etc., and those who try to survive in them?
How indigeneity could address the, I guess, I'm always for more Indigenous people being in positions of authority on these questions, because we often have very radically different ways of dealing with conflict. I know in my own culture, we're not a majority wins all culture, we're a consensus culture. And that requires coming to terms with each other's differences, which is a lot more demanding than saying the majority wants this and therefore we're going to do it. I think that, I would love to see, you'd be amazed how few, say, Native American people are in history departments, and how, across the country. And that's just, there's been a rush lately, to try to find more in the aftermath of the George Floyd issue and the tumult that brought about. But in the end, we need more Indigenous people and more Indigenous perspectives in trying to solve some of these cultural problems. They're, it's not a new phenomenon to disagree with people, but sometimes different ways of dealing with that could be really welcome.
Yeah. The next question asks, there is scholarship that claims that the Five Nations had significant influence in early American democracy, shaping central concepts used by the founding fathers when writing the Constitution. What is your take on that claim, and its erasure from the history of we teach?
My own is probably that I don't want to overstate the claim. I've looked at that history a lot, and to be sure, figures like Benjamin Franklin recognized the value and the wisdom in the formation of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, right? Of these, at that time, 6 nations coming together and forming a kind of a confederacy, a group bound together for mutual aid and protection, but relatively autonomous within that structure. He does recognize that, he mentions it, but I wouldn't want to overstate that, we're the ones responsible for the Constitution. Partly, I always think, I don't want to take credit, I don't want us to have to take credit for the mess that the US has become lately. But I think that it's in there by some thinkers like Franklin, but there's a lot more Locke and other people in the Constitution than there are Haudenosaunee ideas. If they had listened better, I think we'd be in better position. But it's a kind of recognition of a valuable system in passing, but he does go on to say something, Franklin, kind of derogatory, like, and if these savages can figure it out, surely we can. So, it's not a unalloyed praise.
The next question asks, outside of NAGPRA, are there legislative actions we might pursue domestically in the US in order to better support repatriation of cultural items to their home nations?
Right, so NAGPRA, not everyone may know that term, so it stands for the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, and that comes about in 1990. That is specifically addresses human remains that are in collections, and alas, that's a lot of collections, and also grave objects, grave plunder, and culturally sensitive sacred objects, etc. Those, all museums have to undergo a process, all museums that receive federal aid, that is, have to go a process of reviewing, have a NAGPRA review to see if they're in compliance with the law. That aside, to go further on that, I would say that, I don't know about legislatively going further, but I think there's a certain cultural and ethical pressure that we can put on institutions, or the institutions can do some soul searching and put that pressure on themselves. I think that's precisely what happened with the corn planter pipe tomahawk, is that they realized this hasn't been part of our collection for 80 years. We haven't really missed it, as it were. And why should we have it? And I'm delighted there are curators like Gwen Saul at Albany now that, you know, have really made an effort to make relationships with Native communities, or what they call source communities there. I think if museums started doing that work, making those efforts to reach out to source communities, they would have a much better sense of what might, you know, be appropriate to return, and what is desired by the community, and so on. And they would have a better sense of the significance of their collection and what things mean to people today in those communities.
So we have a question about repatriation, not from museums, but from individual households. The listener asks, is it ethical to keep spear points and arrowheads that my father found as a child between 1928 and 1940? If not, how can I return them to families of those who created them? Based upon my father's residence as a child, Northeast Ohio, I believe that the artifacts are Haudenosaunee, Lenape, or Mingo in origin.
No, I think that's a good question. And I think that it really depends on the object. Objects like those are common enough, right? They were largely disposable things. They were utilitarian things, and didn't hold, you know, sacred or culturally significant value per se. I would say, you know, if you think that they'd better serve by being in a museum or setting, you might offer them to a native-run cultural institution if they have a desire for them. But I don't think that I would feel particularly bad about objects like that. I think it's more important that things like medicine masks, sometimes called false faces, or wampum, that's not something that should be privately held by individuals outside the community, and really you should talk to someone in the community about it. But in terms of an object like an arrowhead, I think it would be relatively safe to keep it if you wanted it, or to offer it to a Native museum if they wanted it.
Right. The next question asks, how are the nations dealing with the policy of museums holding artifacts, such as the one at the University of Pennsylvania museums, when there is a dispute among the indigenous themselves as to which nation should possess the particular object?
Now, I mean, such things will happen, right? This is always going to be the case, and where provenance is unclear or simply absent, these are particular cases, right? That I think no one policy can decide. I think that different communities may have feel that they have claim to certain things. There's often argument over territory, even metaphorically. So if we're talking about a land acknowledgement, there'll be another group that says that was also our territory. And then the one acknowledged may say, you know, we have no memory of that. So there are going to be such disputes. I mean, these are human communities and these are human problems, but I don't think it can be solved with a one-size-fits-all policy. I think it really has to be looked at carefully case by case, and it may not come to anyone's happy resolution. Who knows?
Yeah. The next question is about Indian territories and boundaries. So drawing territorial boundaries on a map seems to enact a claim of possession. How fluid do you understand Indigenous boundaries to have been? And what did this boundary imply by way of ownership? How does the commonplace notion that in Indigenous nations of land management, there was no such thing as owning lands, square with the utility of such boundaries marking, and with the entire land rematriation project?
Right. No, that's a great question, and a complicated one, but I would say the concept of ownership of land in a Western way, in a European way, like fee simple individuals owning land, is foreign to Indigenous peoples. But that a community controlled and owned certain territories was a longstanding thing in the more sedentary or regional communities of the Eastern Woodlands. So it wasn't that we're just all completely nomadic, and the English used to say, well, that was an English use of why they could take native land, is that they were very invested in this notion that we had no concept of owning it, that we just kind of wandered around it. And we definitely had our territories. And sometimes people did have individual areas that, say they were farming or a sugar bush or something like that, that a family used and claimed kind of proprietary rights, but it didn't have the same sense as this amount of square, yards or meters is my family's land and you have to get off of it type of thing. But we did have a sense of our boundaries, the boundaries between, Mohawk territory and Oneida territory. They're not just imaginary. They had a sense of certain markers, physical markers on the land. Beyond that, we won't go, because it was also about a sense of sharing those lands within a community that were deemed enough to support the population's needs. Again, not being cultures that build up, wealth, but rather take what we need and no more. That land base was an important part of our sense of ourselves as a community, who we were, where we were. And so we do have lands, right? I mean, those are our territories. Those are our traditional homelands, however we put it. But when it comes to English senses of bounding the land with fencing and stone fences and all these things that are important to the English colonists from the very beginning, to show that you owned land, you walled it off. And that we don't have that, but we do have a sense of this is our territory. And in certain areas where they were not, things like rivers were shared, and certain spaces like the Adirondacks, or places where we didn't have communities living in large numbers, we had a concept called one dish with one spoon. And it was the sense that everyone took a turn with that utensil and took just as much as they needed out of the common pot, which was, in this case, the Adirondack region, and passed the spoon on to the next person. And no one would have singular claim over, you can't take any game or, raw materials from this space. It was a shared space.
Yeah, definitely a different concept. Regarding your use of the term ethnographic collecting, in a scholarly sense, it is thoroughly on target. Yet, does the othering inherent in ethnographic work to the benefit of Native peoples, or consign them to a subaltern category?
I think that what it consigns us to a subaltern category is the dominance, the military and political domination of our peoples by the majority culture. To me, it's very much about power, not some kind of essential or existential quality of Indigenous peoples, but the fact that we are, in the face of the military might of nation states, often very vulnerable. That in itself, places us at a subaltern level. And then the control of those forms of interpretation, whether it be ethnographic or visual, is another aspect of that domination. So I feel like the very fact that, Native people have been, robbed of, our languages by boarding schools and policy, and then, some settlers will feel content to say, well, they talk about being Native, but they don't even speak their own language. I mean, it's so galling, that people feel comfortable holding up their invented notion of authenticity to us and saying we fail it. How does that happen? How do I become the inauthentic representative of myself? And yet Native people are put in that position all the time. We've been, removed, we've been dispossessed, we've been schooled out of our own culture, converted, forced assimilated, and then people turn around with a certain contempt and say, and you're not very Native anymore. What is that supposed to mean, right? And I feel like that's a position thrust on us by power, and a dynamic that we've had to endure and adapt to and come up with strategies over and over to refit whatever they're throwing at us at the moment, right?
Yeah, just one very quick question. I'll cut it very short. Can you give us some suggestion about how Native objects can be used in education exactly to elaborate on a counter narrative to the one that you just talked about?
I think where possible, and it won't always be possible, but where possible, I want the object to point to the community that created it, right? The object is silent. The object cannot speak for itself, but there are representatives of that community that could physically be present and talk about an object, or you could read about it from their perspective, etc. But I like objects that point us back to someone's home place and the object's home place, so that we can have a conversation with the makers, with the community, with the people for whom it has significant meaning, and not just talk about it as a physical thing, but rather think of it as a piece of cultural production.
Yeah. Thank you, Scott. This is all we have time today. Thank you so much for the insightful and enlightening, I would say, presentation. I also want to thank you, the audience, for the terrific questions. I hope you'll be able to join us for other Radcliffe virtual programs. You can find out about future programs and watch videos of past events at radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you again for joining us today, and have a good rest of the day. Bye.